On July 11, 1944, in a stone farmhouse 6 miles south of Saint-Lô, a German intelligence officer sat at a table covered with American documents. They had been pulled from the body of a captain killed that morning near the hedgerow line west of the Vier River. A leather map case, a folded operations order, a notebook with grid coordinates. The intelligence officer, an IC, the staff position responsible for analyzing enemy intentions, opened the operations order and began to read. He read it twice. Then he turned it over, looking for the rest. There was no rest. The entire order fit on a single page. 5 short paragraphs. The first described the enemy situation in 2 sentences. The second stated the mission, 1 sentence. The third, the execution paragraph, named an objective and a direction of attack. It said nothing about formations, nothing about timing beyond an H-hour, nothing about what the companies should do if the lead platoon was stopped, or if the left flank was exposed, or if the hedgerow beyond the first field turned out to be fortified. It said almost nothing at all. The IIC set the page down and opened the notebook. More grid coordinates, a few names, a sketch of a road junction. No detailed fire plan, no phase lines with scheduled timings. No coordination instructions between adjacent units that would reveal the shape of a larger operation. He had seen German orders. He had written German orders. A German regimental attack order for an operation of comparable size would run 6 to 10 pages. It would specify the axis of advance for each battalion, the boundaries between them, the fire support schedule minute by minute, the signals for each phase, the rally points if the attack stalled, the fallback positions if it failed. A German order was a machine. Every part designed, every contingency addressed, every subordinate told precisely what to do and when to do it. What he held in his hands was not a machine. It was a sentence and a direction. Take that hill. Attack at 0600. The rest, how to get there, what to do when things went wrong, how to coordinate with the unit on your right, was apparently left to the men on the ground. To the IC, this was not a plan. It was the absence of a plan. The story of how American soldiers turned that empty page into the most effective fighting system of the war is worth telling. If you agree, a like and a subscription help it reach the people who want to hear it. Here is what that German officer could not have known sitting in that farmhouse in Normandy with a dead captain's paperwork. He was not looking at incompetence. He was looking at the end product of a 17-year revolution in how America trained its officers to think, a revolution that had been launched, with considerable irony, by a man who borrowed the idea from the Germans. And that single page, the one that looked like nothing, was about to become the most dangerous document in the war. Not because of what it contained, because of what it left out. To understand why, you need to see what American orders looked like before. Because the army that wrote this one-page order in July 1944 was not the same army that had gone to war 18 months earlier. That army wrote long, detailed orders. That army planned every movement days in advance. That army sent those plans into battle. And a German field marshal named Erwin Rommel tore it apart in 72 hours. The place was called Kasserine Pass, and the orders the Germans captured there told them everything they wanted to know. On February 14, 1943, 17 months before that IC officer sat puzzling over a dead captain's paperwork in Normandy, the United States Army fought the German Wehrmacht for the first time in a place called Kasserine Pass in the mountains of western Tunisia. The Americans had been in North Africa since November, landing against Vichy French resistance that crumbled in days. They had pushed east toward Tunisia, skirmishing with German rearguards, feeling confident. Most of the officers had never heard a shot fired in anger. Most of the soldiers had been civilians 14 months earlier. They had trained stateside on outdated equipment, run exercises based on textbook problems, and arrived in Africa believing they were ready. They were not ready. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, retreating west after his defeat at El Alamein, saw an opportunity. The Americans were spread thin across a 60-mile front, their units intermixed with French formations, their supply lines exposed. And Rommel had something no amount of American enthusiasm could counter: 4 years of combat experience against the British, and an intuition for finding the weak point in a line. But Rommel also had something else. He had captured American documents. In the weeks before the main assault, German patrols and reconnaissance units had seized operations orders, intelligence estimates, logistics plans. And what the German intelligence staff found in those documents was a gift. The American orders were long. They were detailed. They specified unit positions, movement routes, timing schedules, supply dump locations, communication frequencies. A German staff officer reading a captured American regimental order could reconstruct, almost move by move, what the Americans intended to do for the next 72 hours. The German word for this was like reading the enemy's hand in a card game. Rommel knew where the thin points were. He knew which units were under strength. He knew the timing of planned reliefs. And on February 14th, he struck. The assault hit Major General Lloyd Friedendahl's 2nd Corps like a freight train. Friedendahl, commanding from a headquarters bunker carved into rock 70 miles behind the front, had issued a set of orders so convoluted that his own officers struggled to interpret them. One order to the 1st Armored Division contained references to map coordinates without specifying which map sheet. Another used personal code words. Friedendahl called landmarks by private nicknames that appeared on no chart. His subordinates received long, elaborate instructions that told them what to do in precise detail, but gave them no framework for what to do if the plan fell apart. The plan fell apart in the first 6 hours. German panzers punched through the pass. American tank destroyer battalions, positioned according to doctrine rather than terrain, were overrun before they could engage. Artillery batteries that had been placed by the book found themselves firing into empty ground because the Germans had not advanced along the axis the American plan assumed. Infantry companies that had been told to hold specific positions held them, even when holding made no tactical sense, because their orders said hold, and no one had told them what to do if the position became untenable. The Americans retreated 50 miles in 5 days. Over 900 were killed. Nearly 5,000 were captured or went missing. Rommel's Africa Corps seized enough American equipment to fill a supply depot: trucks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, and stacks of additional documents that confirmed what the Germans already suspected. The Americans planned in elaborate detail, followed those plans rigidly, and when the plan broke, they froze. The German after-action reports sent back to Berlin were dismissive. American equipment was adequate but unimpressive. American tactics were textbook, predictable, and brittle. The American soldier fought bravely enough as an individual, but his officers could not adapt under pressure. The conclusion, circulated through German intelligence channels, was reassuring. The Americans were not a serious tactical opponent. Remember that conclusion, because it was about to become one of the most expensive miscalculations of the entire war. Here is what the Germans did not do after Kasserine. They did not study the battle intensely. They had won. They had validated what they already believed. They filed the reports and moved on to the next problem, which was the British Eighth Army closing in from the east. Here is what the Americans did. Within 72 hours of the disaster, Eisenhower relieved Friedendahl. In his place, he sent a man named George Smith Patton, Jr., who arrived at 2nd Corps headquarters on March 6, 1943, and began dismantling everything Friedendahl had built. Not the fortifications, not the supply lines, but the culture. The way officers thought, the way they gave orders, the way they related to the men who had to execute them. But Patton was a symptom, not the cause. The real transformation was deeper, and it had been set in motion 15 years earlier by a man who never fired a shot in World War II. A man who, in 1927, had watched a top graduate of the Army's own infantry school stand paralyzed in front of 70 soldiers because he could not draft a written field order, and decided, in that moment, that the entire system was broken. His name was George Catlett Marshall, and the revolution he started in a Georgia classroom was about to rewrite the rules of modern war. In the autumn of 1927, a 47-year-old lieutenant colonel named George Marshall arrived at Fort Benning, Georgia, to take over the academic department of the United States Army Infantry School. He had just buried his wife. Friends in Washington had arranged for him to have his pick of assignments, and he chose the one place where he believed he could change something that had been eating at him for a decade. Marshall had served as a senior planner in France during the Great War. He had helped design the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest American military operation in history to that point, and he had watched it nearly collapse. Not because the soldiers lacked courage, but because the system that was supposed to guide them had choked on its own complexity. Orders arrived late. When they arrived, they were too long to read under fire and too rigid to adapt when conditions changed. Officers who had graduated at the top of their class stood frozen in the field because nothing in their training had prepared them for a situation that did not match the textbook problem. One incident crystallized it. During a training exercise in Tientsin, China, where Marshall served in the mid-20s, he watched a young officer, a man who had finished first in his class at Fort Benning, become completely paralyzed when asked to draft a field order for 70 men based on a sketch of the terrain. The officer knew the format. He knew the 5-paragraph structure. He knew every doctrinal principle. But he could not translate what he saw in front of him into a decision because his entire education had trained him to produce elaborate written documents, not to think. Marshall would later say, "The man was no fool, but he had been taught an absurd system." When Marshall walked into Fort Benning that November, the infantry school was 9 years old and already calcified. Instructors read approved lectures word for word from scripts vetted by committee. Students solved map problems that had predetermined correct answers, the infamous school solutions. Field orders and exercises ran pages long, with every movement specified, every contingency cataloged, every subordinate told precisely where to stand and when to move. The system produced officers who could draft beautiful documents. It did not produce officers who could fight. Marshall began destroying it within weeks. He worked quietly at first. He later admitted he moved quietly and gradually because he knew the resistance would be fierce. He replaced instructors with men fresh from troop duty, officers who knew the difference between a classroom problem and a real firefight. He banned the reading of scripted lectures. He eliminated school solutions and replaced them with open-ended tactical problems where the student had to make a decision under time pressure with incomplete information and defend that decision against instructors who challenged every assumption. And then he attacked the orders themselves. Marshall insisted that no field order in any exercise at the infantry school would exceed 1 page. No intelligence estimate would exceed 1 page. He told his instructors, and through them, an entire generation of future commanders, that a workable decision made quickly was worth more than a perfect decision made too late. The real problem, he said, is usually not what the decision should be. It is when to make it. Hold that thought, because what Marshall was building at Benning was not just a preference for short paperwork. It was a philosophy of war. The idea that the chaos of battle cannot be controlled from above, that no plan survives contact with the enemy, and that the only army that wins is the one whose junior leaders can think for themselves when the plan falls apart. His phrase for it became famous inside the infantry school: expunge the bunk, complications, and ponderosities. What Marshall may not have known, and what makes this story something more than a tale of good management, is where the American system of field orders came from in the first place. In 1897, 30 years before Marshall arrived at Benning, a captain named Eben Swift was teaching at the Army's Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Swift had gotten hold of a French translation of a book by a Prussian officer named Julius von Verdi du Vernois. a manual on tactical decision games, on how to train officers to make rapid decisions with imperfect information. Swift adapted the Prussian method for American use, and in the process, he created the 5-paragraph field order. Situation, mission, execution, administration, command, and signal. He also institutionalized what became known as the applicatory method, teaching through problems, not lectures, learning by deciding, not memorizing. The irony is almost too perfect to believe. The format that would one day baffle German intelligence officers had been built at its foundation from a Prussian idea. The Americans had taken a German concept, stripped it down, simplified it, and embedded it so deeply into their training system that by 1944, a 23-year-old lieutenant in Normandy could issue a one-page order that accomplished what a 10-page German Befehl was designed to do, and did it faster because the American version trusted the man on the ground to fill in the gaps. But that trust did not exist yet when the war began. Marshall trained 150 future generals at Benning between 1927 and 32. He planted the seeds. But seeds take time. When those officers took their divisions to North Africa in 1942, they carried Marshall's philosophy in their heads and ran straight into an institutional army that still wrote long orders, still centralized decisions, still expected subordinates to execute plans exactly as written. Kasserine was the collision between what Marshall had taught and what the Army had not yet learned. The question was whether the Army could close that gap, not in years, not in months, but in weeks, because Rommel was not going to wait. And the answer to that question came from an unlikely place, not from a general, not from a war college, from a set of mimeographed pages that began circulating through American units in Tunisia in the spring of 1943, pages that looked nothing like any training manual the Army had ever produced. They were called battle lessons, and the man who drove them into every company, every platoon, every foxhole was a 3-star general that most Americans have never heard of. His name was Leslie McNair, and what he built was the fastest institutional learning machine any army had ever seen. Lieutenant General Leslie James McNair was the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy action in the European theater. He died on July 25, 1944, when an American bomb fell short during the carpet bombing that opened Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. He was 61 years old. His body was so badly destroyed that he was identified by the 3 stars on his collar. But that was the end of his story. The part that matters here is what he built before he died. In March of 1942, McNair was given command of Army Ground Forces, the organization responsible for training every American soldier, every division, every corps that would fight in Europe and the Pacific. He had been the commandant at Fort Leavenworth before the war, the same institution where Eben Swift had created the 5-paragraph order 4 decades earlier. McNair understood Marshall's philosophy because he had helped shape it. And now Marshall, as Chief of Staff, gave him the authority to embed that philosophy into the entire Army. McNair's system worked like this. After every engagement, every firefight, every patrol, every battalion attack, units were required to produce after-action reports. Not the polished staff documents that generals submitted to headquarters. Raw reports from the men who had been in the fight. What worked, what failed, what the enemy did that they did not expect, what they improvised that was not in any manual. These reports were collected, distilled into what the Army called battle lessons, mimeographed, and distributed to every unit in the theater. Not in months, not in weeks, but in days. The speed was the point. A lesson learned by a rifle company near Gafsa on a Tuesday could be in the hands of a platoon leader near Matur by the following week. The system was industrial. The same mass production logic that built Liberty ships and Sherman tanks applied not to metal, but to knowledge. The Army was teaching itself to fight in real time, using its own casualties as the curriculum. And the lessons were brutal in their honesty. After Kasserine, the battle lessons that circulated through Second Corps did not soften the disaster. They named the failures directly. Units had been spread too thin. Commanders had placed tank destroyers according to peacetime doctrine rather than actual terrain. Officers had waited for orders from above instead of acting on what they could see. Communication had collapsed because units depended on telephone wire that German artillery cut in the first barrage. And no one had trained on radio as a backup. But the lessons did not stop at diagnosis. They prescribed. Keep orders short. Tell your subordinates what to achieve, not how to achieve it. If your radio goes dead, act on the last known intent of your commander. If you see an opportunity, take it. Do not wait for permission. A workable decision now is worth more than a perfect decision in an hour. That language will sound familiar. It was Marshall's language from Fort Benning 15 years earlier, reaching the foxholes of North Africa through mimeographed paper. And then something happened that the Germans did not anticipate. The Americans started changing. Not next year, not next campaign, but in the middle of the same campaign, between battles, sometimes between engagements on the same day. After Kasserine, Eisenhower replaced Friedendahl with Patton. Patton imposed discipline, visibility, aggression. He was in every unit, at every crossroad, impossible to miss. But beneath the theater of Patton's personality, the real change was structural. Second Corps rewrote its standard operating procedures. Orders got shorter. Briefings got faster. Subordinate commanders were told the objective and given latitude on the approach. Artillery liaisons were pushed down to battalion level so that a company commander in contact could call fire without routing the request through regiment. At El Guitar on March 23, 1943, 5 weeks after Kasserine, the 10th Panzer Division attacked what it expected to be the same brittle American force it had broken in February. It ran into the 1st Infantry Division, dug in on high ground with interlocking fields of fire, artillery pre-registered on every approach, and infantry that did not retreat when the 1st Panzers appeared. The Germans lost 32 tanks. They pulled back, regrouped, and attacked again. They lost more. It was not a perfect American victory, but it was something more important. It was proof, visible, measurable proof, that the American army could learn faster than the enemy expected. 5 weeks. Not a new army. The same men, the same equipment, reorganized around a different idea of how to fight. And now comes the part that German intelligence missed entirely. The Germans analyzed El Guitar the way they analyzed every engagement, tactically. They noted the improved American defensive positions, the better use of terrain, the effective artillery. They attributed the change to new leadership. Patton was aggressive, they acknowledged that, but they did not see the system behind the general. They did not understand that what happened at El Guitar was not one commander's personality. It was an institutional machine that collected failure, converted it into doctrine, and distributed it faster than any army in history had ever done. The Germans could not see this because they had nothing to compare it to. The Wehrmacht's own after-action process was thorough. German Erfahrungsberichte were detailed and self-critical, more demanding the higher the headquarters. But the German system fed upward. Lessons went to Corps, to Army, to OKH. They informed doctrine that was then disseminated downward through official channels. The process took months. It was rigorous. It was professional. And by 1943, it was too slow. The American system fed sideways. A company in the 34th Division learned something on Monday, and a company in the 1st Armored Division was training on it by Friday. The knowledge moved laterally, through battle lessons, through informal officer networks, through what one historian later called the most aggressive institutional learning culture any modern army had produced. and every cycle of that machine made American field orders shorter. Not because officers were getting lazy, because the men receiving those orders needed less instruction. They had been trained, in classrooms, in exercises, in battle, to understand intent, to read a one-paragraph execution order and fill in the blanks with their own judgment. That is what was happening inside the American Army between Kasserine and Normandy. 16 months of relentless, self-correcting adaptation. By the time the first American divisions loaded onto transports for England in late 1943, the army boarding those ships was not the army that had stumbled ashore in North Africa. But here's the part no one talks about. While the Americans were becoming more decentralized, more flexible, more trusting of junior leaders, the army that had invented those very principles was moving in the opposite direction. And the reason why is one of the great unspoken tragedies of the German War. The German army that invaded Poland in September of 1939 was, by almost universal agreement among military historians, the most tactically sophisticated ground force on Earth. And the reason was a single idea, an idea so deeply embedded in German military culture that it did not even have a proper translation in English. Auftragstaktik. The word is usually rendered as mission-type orders or mission command, but both translations miss the point. Auftragstaktik was not a format for writing orders. It was a way of thinking about war. The principle, codified in the German Army's 1933 manual Truppenführung, stated it plainly. A commander tells his subordinate what to achieve and why. He does not tell him how. The subordinate decides the method based on what he sees on the ground. And if the situation changes so completely that the original mission no longer makes sense, the subordinate is expected, not merely permitted, expected to act on his own judgment, provided his action serves the higher commander's intent. An officer who failed to seize an opportunity was considered as guilty as one who disobeyed an order. This was not theory. This was how the Wehrmacht actually fought in Poland, in France, in the opening months of Barbarossa. German company commanders made decisions that American or British officers of equivalent rank would have referred to battalion. German battalion commanders maneuvered as if they were running independent brigades. The system required extraordinary trust between ranks, and the Germans built that trust deliberately through years of war games, staff rides, cross-posting officers between branches, and an education system at the Kriegsakademie that trained every officer to function 2 levels above his current rank. A platoon commander was expected to understand how a battalion fights. A battalion commander was expected to think like a regimental commander. The results, in 1939 and 40, were devastating. French and British forces, operating on centralized command models where every decision flowed up and every order flowed down, could not match the tempo. German units at the point of contact made decisions in minutes that their opponents needed hours to process. The fall of France in 6 weeks was not primarily a victory of tanks or aircraft. It was a victory of speed, decision speed, not movement speed. The Germans decided faster because the men making the decisions were closer to the ground. And then Adolf Hitler began to kill it. The process was gradual. It did not begin with a single order or a dramatic confrontation. It began with success. The victories of 39 and 40 convinced Hitler that his own strategic intuition was superior to his general's professional judgment. After the near disaster before Moscow in December 1941, when German forces fell back under Soviet counterattack and several generals urged retreat, Hitler issued his famous Stand Fast order, forbidding any withdrawal without his personal approval. When several commanders retreated anyway, saving their units from encirclement, Hitler relieved them. The message was clear. Initiative, the very quality Auftragstaktik was designed to foster, was now punishable. Over the next 2 years, the centralization accelerated. By 1943, divisional commanders on the Eastern Front needed Army-level approval to pull back a battalion. By 1944, the paralysis had reached grotesque proportions. On the night of June 5th, the night before D-Day, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the supreme commander of all German forces in the West, wanted to move 2 panzer divisions toward the Normandy coast. He could not. The divisions were classified as OKW Reserve. They could not be released without Hitler's personal order. Hitler was asleep. His staff refused to wake him. The panzers did not move. Think about what that means. The army that had conquered France in 6 weeks because a lieutenant could make a decision without asking a colonel, that army could not move 2 tank divisions to repel an invasion because a corporal in a bunker in Bavaria had not been woken up. The Truppenführung was still on the shelf. Officers still studied Auftragstaktik at staff colleges. The language of initiative still appeared in field manuals. But the living practice, the trust, the tolerance for error, the willingness to let a subordinate act and accept the consequences, was being strangled by a command structure that concentrated every meaningful decision at the top. And the men in the field knew it. In the secret recordings made at Trent Park, the English country estate north of London, where British intelligence held captured German generals and recorded their private conversations through hidden microphones, the frustration is audible even in transcript. 84 generals passed through Trent Park between 1942 and 45. They ate well, drank whiskey, walked the gardens, and talked. They did not know that every word was captured on acetate discs by German-speaking listeners hidden in the basement, many of them Jewish refugees who had fled the very regime these generals served. The generals talked about everything: weapons, tactics, Hitler. And again, they talked about what had gone wrong with command. How decisions that should have taken minutes now took days. How a division commander had to ask permission to move a company. How the old way, the way they had been trained, the way their fathers had fought, was being replaced by something rigid, fearful, and slow. One general put it simply: the army had become a machine for transmitting orders downward and excuses upward. Initiative had been replaced by obedience. And obedience, without the freedom to act, was just a way of avoiding blame. Now hold these 2 pictures side by side. In the spring of 1944, the American Army was running the fastest institutional learning machine in military history. Battle lessons cycling through units in days. Officers trained at Benning and Leavenworth to issue 1-page orders and trust their subordinates to fill in the gaps. A system that had absorbed the catastrophe of Kasserine and rebuilt itself in weeks, not years. An army where a sergeant who saw an opportunity was expected to take it, and where the worst sin was not making a mistake, it was doing nothing. At the same time, the German army, the army that had written the book on exactly this kind of warfare, was freezing. Every layer of command looking upward for permission, every bold decision carrying the risk of relief or worse. An army where the safest course of action was to follow the order to the letter, even when the letter made no sense, because deviating from the order meant personal responsibility, and personal responsibility under Hitler meant a noose. 2 armies, moving in opposite directions, were about to collide on the beaches of Normandy. And the collision would produce a document, a single captured page, that told the entire story of the war in miniature. The IC officer who would pick up that page did not yet know what he was looking at. He would see brevity and read incompetence. He would see gaps and read carelessness. He would see the absence of detailed instructions and conclude that the Americans did not know how to plan. He was holding a mirror, and the reflection was his own army's past, the doctrine of initiative, of trust, of short, clear orders and subordinates who think, translated into English by men who had never heard the word Auftragstaktik, but had absorbed its deepest principle through a chain that ran from a Prussian manual to Eben Swift's classroom to George Marshall's revolution to a mimeographed battle lesson in a foxhole in Tunisia. The German officer was looking at his own army's best idea, perfected by someone else. He just did not recognize it. On June 6, 1944, everything the Americans had built was tested at once, and for the first 12 hours, it looked like it had failed. At Omaha Beach, the plan disintegrated before the first wave reached the sand. The tide was wrong. The current pushed landing craft hundreds of yards east of their assigned sectors. The preliminary bombardment, designed to suppress German positions on the bluffs, had overshot. Most of the bombs landed in empty fields behind the defenses. The DD tanks that were supposed to swim ashore and provide cover sank in the rough seas. 27 out of 32 went down in the 1st Battalion's sector alone. The men who stumbled off the ramps into chest-deep water did so without armor, without suppressive fire, without any of the conditions their detailed loading plans had assumed. The plan was gone. And for a German officer watching from the bluff above, through binoculars, through the slit of a concrete bunker, what happened next should have been predictable. An army that depends on detailed orders should freeze when the orders no longer apply. The men should cluster behind obstacles. They should wait for instructions. They should do what soldiers without initiative have done in every war. They should die in place. That is not what happened. What happened on Omaha Beach between 7 and 10 in the morning has been described by historians as organized chaos, but that phrase misses the precision of it. Small groups of men, squads, half-squads, sometimes just 3 or 4 soldiers who had never met before that morning, began moving. Not because anyone ordered them to, because the men who were trained under Marshall's system, who had absorbed 15 months of battle lessons from North Africa and Sicily, who had been told in every exercise that a decision now beats a perfect decision later, those men looked at the bluff and started climbing. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment said the words that would later stand for the entire morning. There are 2 kinds of people who are staying on this beach: the dead and those who are about to die. Now let's get off this beach. But Taylor was articulating what dozens of sergeants and lieutenants were already doing without a colonel's permission. They were blowing gaps in wire with Bangalore torpedoes. They were finding draws, the shallow ravines cut into the bluff face, and pushing men through them in single file under fire. They were calling in naval gunfire by improvised signals because their radios were waterlogged and dead. None of this was in the plan. All of it worked. A staff sergeant named Technical Sergeant Philip Stretzik led a group from the 16th Infantry up a draw near the E1 exit, knocking out a machine gun position with grenades and working behind the German trench line. A lieutenant named Jimmy Monteith, 27, from Richmond, Virginia, led 2 tanks through a minefield he had spotted a gap in, then personally directed fire on German positions from an exposed hillside until he was killed. First Sergeant Leonard Lommel of the 2nd Ranger Battalion scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, found that the guns his unit had been sent to destroy had been moved inland, tracked them to an orchard a mile away, and disabled them with thermite grenades, a mission he improvised entirely because the original plan no longer applied. Each of these men acted without orders. Each made a tactical decision based on what he saw, not what a document told him to do. And each, without knowing it, was executing the principle that George Marshall had drilled into the infantry school 15 years earlier. When the plan fails, the man on the ground becomes the plan. By noon, the Americans were on the bluff. By evening, they held a strip of Norman farmland a mile deep. The cost was over 2,000 casualties, but the beach was taken, not by a plan, but by the accumulated decisions of hundreds of junior leaders who had been trained to act when no one was telling them what to do. Now, imagine you are a German 1C officer in the days that follow. Your job is to read captured American documents and predict what the Americans will do next. You have been trained in a system where an enemy's operational order reveals his intentions: the axis of advance, the the phase lines, the coordination between adjacent units. If you can capture a division order, you can anticipate the division's movements for the next 48 hours. This is how intelligence works. This is how it has always worked. You capture an American company order from the hedgerow fighting south of Omaha. You open it. 5 paragraphs. The situation paragraph notes that German resistance is expected to be moderate to heavy. The mission paragraph says the company will attack south to seize crossroads at grid reference 4738. The execution paragraph assigns a direction of attack, designates a support element, and states the commander's intent in 2 sentences. There is no phase line schedule, no prescribed formation, no contingency for what to do if the company hits a fortified hedgerow, which, in Normandy, was every 50 yards. You look at this and you cannot build an intelligence picture from it. You cannot predict where the company's platoons will be at any given hour because the order does not specify where they will be. You cannot anticipate flanking movements because the order does not prescribe them. You cannot identify the Schwerpunkt, the main point of effort, because the order distributes responsibility to the platoon leaders and tells them to figure it out. The document is useless to you. Not because it is poorly written, because the information you need, the detailed, step-by-step plan, does not exist. It was never written down. It lives in the heads of 3 platoon leaders and 9 squad leaders who will make their decisions when they see the ground, not before. And this is where the story turns from an anecdote about paperwork into something much larger. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, the bocage, a nightmare landscape of ancient earthen banks topped with dense vegetation that turned every field into a fortress, the German defenders had an enormous tactical advantage. Each hedgerow was a natural defensive position. Each field was a kill zone. A defending squad with a machine gun and good fields of fire could hold a single hedgerow against a platoon for hours. The Germans expected the Americans to do what they had always done, what any army trained on centralized orders would do. Attack frontally, along a prescribed axis. Take casualties. Wait for reinforcements. Request new orders. Attack again. Instead, the Americans did something the Germans could not predict because it was not in any document they could capture. They adapted at the squad level. Sergeants developed their own techniques for crossing hedgerows. Some used explosives to blow gaps in the earthen banks. Some had tanks push through while infantry suppressed from the flanks. Some, and this became the famous innovation, welded steel teeth cut from German beach obstacles onto the front of Sherman tanks, turning them into hedgerow-cutting machines. A sergeant named Curtis Cullen from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron is credited with the idea. He built the first prototype from scrap metal on a Normandy beach. No general ordered the Cullen hedgerow cutter. No staff study recommended it. No doctrinal publication described it. A sergeant saw a problem, invented a solution, and within weeks the modification was being welded onto Shermans across the entire First Army front. That is the McNair system. Battle lessons moving sideways, innovation rising from the bottom, operating in real time on a battlefield where the enemy could not understand why the Americans kept doing things that were not in their own orders. Because they were not in their own orders. That was the point. The orders said, take the next field. The sergeant decided how. And the IC officer in the stone farmhouse, reading that single page, was looking at a system he had been trained to consider impossible. An army that fought without detailed plans. An army whose orders were not a blueprint, but a blank check. An army that had taken the deepest principle of German military thought and stripped it of everything except the essential core. Trust the man closest to the fight. And then embedded it so thoroughly into training, culture, and habit that it no longer needed to be written down. The Germans had a word for what they had lost. They had a manual for it. They had 150 years of tradition behind it. And they were being beaten by it. The pattern repeated across the entire front, and the Germans could not make sense of it. In August of 1944, when Patton's Third Army broke out of Normandy and raced south and east across France, German intelligence officers intercepted American radio traffic and captured additional orders from overrun command posts. What they found was the same baffling pattern they had seen in the hedgerows, but now at a scale that was strategically disorienting. Patton's corps commanders received objectives, not routes. Take Avranches. Seal the Brittany Peninsula. Turn east toward Le Mans. The orders specified what to seize and by when. They did not specify how to get there. Division commanders receiving these orders made their own movement decisions based on what their reconnaissance found: which road was open, which bridge was intact, where the Germans were weak. The result was an advance that followed no single axis that German intelligence could identify and predict. American columns appeared in places the Germans did not expect. At times, the Germans could not anticipate, because the Americans themselves had not decided on those places and times until their lead elements were already moving. A German staff officer trying to plot the American advance on a map would have seen something that looked like chaos: multiple columns on parallel roads, some converging, some diverging, some stopping for hours, and then sprinting 30 miles in a day. There was no recognizable Schwerpunkt, no classic encirclement pattern that matched the templates German officers studied at the Kriegsakademie. The Americans were not executing a plan. They were executing a principle. Move fast, exploit what you find, report back, keep going. And the principle produced a different shape every day because the ground was different every day. For the Wehrmacht, this was an operational nightmare. German defensive doctrine depended on reading the enemy's intentions and concentrating forces at the decisive point. But there was no single decisive point. There were dozens of them, shifting constantly, created not by a commanding general's master plan, but by colonels and majors and captains making independent judgments 50 miles from the nearest headquarters. And the orders those officers carried, when they carried written orders at all, told the Germans nothing. There is a moment in the late summer of 1944 that no single document records, but that emerges from the pattern of German after-action reports filed between August and October. The tone shifts. Early reports from Normandy still describe American tactics as unorthodox or uncoordinated, language that implies the Americans were making mistakes, stumbling into success. By September, the language changes. German officers begin using words like flexible and rapid, and, most telling of all, impossible to anticipate. That last phrase is the confession. When a professional intelligence officer, trained in one of the most rigorous military education systems in history, writes that the enemy is impossible to anticipate, he is not describing a failure of intelligence collection. He is describing a failure of his entire analytical framework. The German system for predicting enemy action was built on a foundational assumption that armies operate according to plans, and plans can be captured, intercepted, or deduced. Remove the plan, and you remove the ability to predict. The Americans had not removed the plan. They had moved it. They had taken the plan out of the document and put it into the training. The document said what? The training said how. And because the how lived in 10,000 heads instead of on one piece of paper, it could never be captured. This is what the IC officer in the farmhouse near Saint-Lô was actually holding. Not a deficient order. A different theory of war. Consider the symmetry. In 1897, Eben Swift at Fort Leavenworth read a Prussian book on tactical decision-making and built from it a format for American field orders, the 5-paragraph order that would become the backbone of American military communication for the next century. In 1927, George Marshall at Fort Benning took that format and stripped it to its essence. One page, clear intent, trust the subordinate. In 1942, Leslie McNair built a machine that took the lessons of combat and drove them into every unit in the Army faster than any bureaucracy had ever moved information. In 1943, Kasserine proved that the old way, long orders, rigid plans, centralized control, would get men killed. In 16 months, the Army rewired itself. And in 1944, on the same continent where the Prussian idea had been born a century and a half earlier, an American army was practicing that idea more effectively than the army that had invented it. The Germans did not see this clearly, because to see it clearly would have required them to admit something unbearable: that the American way of war was not a crude imitation of professional soldiering. It was Auftragstaktik with the safety catch off. The Germans had built Auftragstaktik on a foundation of professional officers educated for years at the Kriegsakademie, men who could be trusted with initiative because they had been trained in a shared doctrine so thoroughly that they could predict each other's decisions. The Americans had achieved something arguably harder. They had taken an army of civilians, factory workers, farmers, clerks, men who had been in uniform for 2 years or less, and trained them to a level of tactical independence that professional German officers would have considered reckless. The difference was systemic. German initiative depended on an elite officer corps. American initiative depended on a training system. The elite officer corps was being destroyed by casualties on the Eastern Front, by Hitler's purges after the July 20th assassination attempt, by the sheer attrition of 4 years of total war. Every German officer killed or relieved took with him years of institutional knowledge that could not be replaced. The American training system was self-replenishing. A squad leader killed at Saint-Lô was replaced by a corporal who had absorbed the same battle lessons, trained on the same applicatory problems, internalized the same one-page order format. The knowledge was not in the man, it was in the system. And the system could not be killed. That is why 1 page of paper mattered more than 10, not because brevity is a virtue, because brevity was the visible surface of something invisible, a training culture that made detailed orders unnecessary. The German officer reading that page was looking at the tip of an iceberg. Everything that made the American army dangerous was underneath, in the millions of hours of exercises, map problems, battle lessons, and field training that had taught a generation of citizen soldiers to think without being told what to think. The document was almost empty. The army that produced it was not. The farmhouse south of Saint-Lô was hit by American artillery on July 18, 1944, 1 week after the IC officer sat at that table reading a dead captain's order. We do not know his name. The records of the intelligence section of the 352nd Infantry Division, the unit that defended Omaha Beach and fought through the hedgerows, were largely destroyed in the weeks that followed, burned by retreating staff officers or lost in the chaos of the Falaise pocket. The division itself was effectively annihilated by late August, reduced from 12,000 men to fewer than 800. The one-page order that puzzled him was one of thousands. The Americans produced them by the hour, typed on portable typewriters and half-tracks, scrawled in pencil on message pads, sometimes delivered verbally with nothing written down at all. Each one told the same story. Take this objective. Here is why it matters. How you get there is up to you. And the army that had produced those orders kept moving. By September of 1944, American forces had crossed the Seine, liberated Paris, and were driving toward the German border at a pace that outran their own supply lines. The operational pattern that had bewildered German intelligence in Normandy now bewildered it across the breadth of France. American units appeared where they were not expected. They attacked when doctrine said they should consolidate. They bypassed strong points that a more methodical army would have reduced, leaving them to wither and surrender when their supply was cut. None of these decisions appeared in captured orders, because none of them had been made in advance. They were made on the ground, by the men who could see the ground, in the moment when the opportunity existed. The German generals who survived the war, and many did, finding their way to prisoner of war camps, to Trent Park, to the American historical interrogation program that produced hundreds of manuscripts about the war, would spend years trying to explain what had happened. Their explanations varied. Some blamed Hitler. Some blamed the loss of air superiority. Some blamed the overwhelming American material advantage, the endless tanks, the endless ammunition, the endless replacements. Almost none of them blamed the thing that had actually beaten them. They did not say, "We were beaten by a training system." They did not say, "We were beaten by one-page orders." They did not say, "We were beaten by an army that trusted sergeants to make decisions that our army required generals to approve." To say these things would have been to admit that the Americans had surpassed the Wehrmacht at the thing the Wehrmacht believed it did better than anyone on earth: the art of decentralized command. But the evidence was in the documents they had captured and could not read. Not because the language was foreign, because the absence was foreign. The empty space on that page, the white space where a German order would have specified formations, timings, phase lines, contingencies, was not a gap. It was a statement. It said, "We trust the man holding this page to do what needs to be done. We trained him to see the problem. We trained him to decide. We do not need to write it down because he already knows." Leslie McNair, the man who built the learning machine, died in Normandy and never saw the army he created win the war. George Marshall, who planted the seed at Fort Benning in 1927, served as chief of staff for the entire conflict and never once visited the front lines in Europe. His war was fought from a desk in Washington, shaping the institution, not commanding the battle. Eben Swift, who borrowed a Prussian idea in 1897 and turned it into the 5-paragraph order, had been dead for 26 years by the time that format carried American armies across France. Curtis Cullen, the sergeant who invented the hedgerow cutter from German beach obstacles, was awarded the Legion of Merit. He survived the war and returned to civilian life. His innovation, built without orders, without authorization, without a single line in any operations plan, was welded onto 3 out of every 5 Sherman tanks in First Army by the time Operation Cobra launched. No staff study produced it. No general conceived it. A sergeant saw a problem, solved it, and the system carried the solution forward at a speed that no centralized command structure could have matched. Jimmy Monteith, the lieutenant who led tanks through a minefield gap on Omaha Beach and directed fire from an exposed hillside, was killed that same afternoon. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. He was 27 years old. His orders that morning had told him to get his company off the beach. They had not told him to find a gap in a minefield, or to lead armor through it, or to stand in the open, directing fire until a German machine gun found him. He did those things because his training, Marshall's training, Benning's training, the training of an army that valued a decision made in the moment over a plan written the night before, had made those things reflexive. That is what the German 1C officer was holding in his hands that July morning in the farmhouse near St. Lo. He was holding the visible trace of an invisible revolution. A revolution that began with a Prussian textbook, passed through an American classroom, survived a disaster in the African desert, and emerged as something no German officer could decode from a captured page. Because the most dangerous thing about that order was not what it said. It was everything it trusted the reader to know without being told. And that trust, between a commander and the men he would never meet, sealed not in ink, but in 10,000 hours of training, was the one weapon the Germans captured again and again and never once understood. I want to thank you for staying with this story for over an hour. That means something. If this video helped you see a piece of the war you hadn't considered before, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep history matters, and it pushes the video toward other viewers who care about getting the details right. If you haven't yet, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in World War II, I'd be honored to hear about them in the comments. These stories belong to all of us. Thank you.